Welcome back to the hashtag 100 Days Project. Hopefully, this will be the conclusion of Rescue Party by Arthur C. Clarke. Fortunately, there had been no serious earthquakes yet. Far beneath the bed of the ocean, the wonderful piece of engineering which had been the world president's private vacuum subway was still working perfectly, unaffected by the tumult and destruction above. It would continue to work until the last minute of the Earth's existence, which, if the astronomers were right, was not much more than 15 minutes away, though precisely how much more Alvaron would have given a great deal to know. It would be nearly an hour before the trapped party could reach land and even the slightest hope of rescue. Alvaron's instructions had been precise, though even without them he would never have dreamed of taking any risks with the great machine that had been entrusted to his care. Had he been human, the decision to abandon the trapped members of his crew would have been desperately hard to make. But he came of a race far more sensitive than man, a race that so loved the things of the spirit that, long ago and with infinite reluctance, it had taken over control of the universe, since only thus could it be sure that justice was being done. Alvaron would need all his superhuman gifts to carry him through the next few hours. Meanwhile, a mile below the bed of the ocean, Alarcane and Zendri were busy indeed with their private communicators. 15 minutes is not a long time in which to wind up the affairs of a lifetime. It is indeed scarcely long enough to dictate more than a few of those farewell messages which, at such moments, are so much more important than all other matters. All the while, the Palladorian had remained silent and motionless, saying not a word. The other two, resigned to their fate and engrossed in their personal affairs, had given it no thought. They were startled when suddenly it began to address them in its peculiarly passionless voice. We perceive that you are making certain arrangements concerning your anticipated destruction. That will probably be unnecessary. Captain Alvaron hopes to rescue us if we can stop this machine when we reach land again. Both Senadri and Alarcane were too surprised to say anything for a moment. When the latter gasped, "How do you know?" It was a foolish question, for he remembered at once that there were several Palladorians, if one could use the phrase, in the S9. Let's try that again. It was a foolish question, for he remembered at once that there were several Palladorians, if one could use the phrase, in the S9000, and consequently their companion knew everything that was happening in the mothership. So he did not wait for an answer, but continued, "Alvaron can't do that. He daren't take such a risk." "There will be no risk," said the Palladorian. "We have told him what to do. It is really very simple." Alarcane and Zenadri looked at their companion with something approaching awe, realizing now what must have happened. In moments of crisis, the single units comprising the Palladorian mind could link together in an organization no less close than that of any physical brain. At such moments, they formed an intellect more powerful than any other in the universe. All ordinary problems could be solved by a few hundred or 1,000 units. Very rarely, millions would be needed, and on two historic occasions, the billions of cells of the entire Palladorian consciousness had been welded together to deal with emergencies that threatened the race. The mind of Pallador was one of the greatest mental resources of the universe. Its full force was seldom required, but the knowledge that it was available was supremely comforting to other races. Alarcane wondered how many cells had coordinated to deal with this particular emergency. He also wondered how so trivial an incident had ever come to its attention. To that question he was never to know the answer, though he might have guessed it had he known that the chillingly remote Palladorian mind possessed an almost human streak of vanity. Long ago, Alarcane had written a book trying to prove that eventually all intelligent races would sacrifice individual consciousness and that one day only group minds would remain in the universe. Pallador, he had said, was the first of those ultimate intellects, and the vast, dispersed mind had not been displeased. They had no time to ask any further questions before Alvaron himself began to speak through their communicators. Alvaron calling, "We're staying on this planet until the detonation waves reach it, so we may be able to rescue you. You're heading toward a city on the coast, which you'll reach in 40 minutes at your present speed. If you cannot stop yourselves then, we're going to blast the tunnel behind and ahead of you to cut off your power. Then we'll sink a shaft to get you out. The chief engineer says he can do it in 5 minutes with the main projectors. So you should be safe within an hour, unless the sun blows up before. And if that happens, you'll be destroyed as well. You mustn't take such a risk." "Don't let that worry you. We're perfectly safe. When the sun detonates, the explosion wave will take several minutes to rise to its maximum. But apart from that, we'll be on the night side of the planet, behind an 8,000-mile screen of rock. When the first warning of the explosion comes, we will accelerate out of the solar system, keeping in the shadow of the planet. Under our maximum drive, we will reach the velocity of light before reaching the cone of the shadow, and the sun cannot harm us then." Synedry was still afraid to hope. Another objection came at once into his mind. "Yes, but how will you get any warning here on the night side of the planet?" "Very easily," replied Alvaron. "The world has a moon which is now visible from this hemisphere. We have telescopes trained on it. If it shows any sudden increase in brilliance, our main drive goes on automatically and will be thrown out of the system." The logic was flawless. Alvaron, cautious as ever, was taking no chances. It would be many minutes before the 8,000-mile shield of rock and metal could be destroyed by the fires of the exploding sun. In that time, the S-9000 could have reached the safety of the velocity of light. Alarcane pressed the second button when they were still several miles from the coast. He did not expect anything to happen then, assuming that the machine could not stop between stations. It seemed too good to be true when, a few minutes later, the machine's slight vibration died away and they came to a halt. The doors slid silently apart. Even before they were fully open, the three had left the compartment. They were taking no more chances. Before them, a long tunnel stretched into the distance, rising slowly out of sight. They were starting along it when suddenly Alvaron's voice called from the communicators. "Stay where you are. We're going to blast." The ground shuddered once, and far ahead there came a rumble of falling rock. Again the earth shook, and 100 yards ahead the passageway vanished abruptly. A tremendous vertical shaft had been cut clean through it. The party hurried forward again until they came to the end of the corridor and stood waiting on its lip. The shaft in which it ended was a full 1,000 feet across and descended into the earth as far as the torches could throw their beams. Overhead, the storm clouds fled beneath a moon that no man could have recognized, so luridly brilliant was its disk. And, most glorious of all sights, the S-9000 floated high above, the great projectors that had drilled the enormous pit still glowing cherry red. A dark shape detached itself from the mothership and dropped swiftly toward the ground. Torquely was returning to collect his friends. A little later, Alvaron greeted them in the control room. He waved to the great vision screen and said quietly, "See, we were barely in time." The continent below them was slowly settling beneath the mile-high waves that were attacking its coasts. The last anyone was ever to see of Earth was a great plain bathed with the silver light of the abnormally brilliant moon. Across its face, the waters were pouring in a glittering flood toward a distant range of mountains. The sea had won its final victory, but its triumph would be short-lived, for soon sea and land would be no more. Even as the silent party in the control room watched the destruction below, the, the infinitely greater catastrophe to which this was only the prelude came swiftly upon them. It was as though dawn had broken suddenly over this moonlit landscape, but it was not dawn. It was only the moon, shining with the brilliance of a second sun. For perhaps 30 seconds, that awesome, unnatural light burnt fiercely on the doomed land beneath. Then there came a sudden flashing of indicator lights across the control board. The main drive was on. For a second, Alvaron glanced at the indicators and checked their information. When he looked again at the screen, Earth was gone. Magnificent, desperately overstrained generators quietly died when the S-9000 was passing the orbit of Persephone. It did not matter. The sun could never harm them now, and although the ship was speeding helplessly out into the lonely night of interstellar space, it would only be a matter of days before rescue came. There was irony in that. A day ago, they had been the rescuers, going to the aid of a race that now no longer existed. For the first time, Alvaron wondered about the world that had just perished. He tried, in vain, to picture it as it had been in its glory. The streets of its cities thronged with life. Primitive though its people had been, they might have offered much to the universe. If only they could have made contact. Regret was useless. Long before their coming, the people of this world must have buried themselves in its iron heart, and now they and their civilization would remain a mystery for the rest of time. Alvaron was glad when his thoughts were interrupted by Rugon's entrance. The chief of communications had been very busy ever since the takeoff, trying to analyze the programs radiated by the transmitter Oristron had discovered. The problem was not a difficult one, but it demanded the construction of special equipment, and that had taken time. "Well, what have you found?" asked Alvaron. "Quite a lot," replied his friend. "There's something mysterious here, and I don't understand it." It didn't take long to find how the vision transmissions were set up, and we've been able to convert them to suit our own equipment. It seems that there were cameras all over the planet, surveying points of interest, some of them apparently in cities, on the tops of very high buildings. The cameras were rotating continuously to give panoramic views. In the programs we've recorded, there are about 20 different scenes. In addition, there are a number of transmissions of a different kind, neither sound nor vision. They seem to be purely scientific, possibly instrument readings or something of that sort. All these programs were going out simultaneously on different frequency bands. Now, there must be a reason for all this. Oristron still thinks that the station simply wasn't switched off when it was deserted. But these aren't the sort of programs such a station would normally radiate at all. It was certainly used for interplanetary relaying. Clarkson was quite right there. So these people must have crossed space, since none of the other planets had any life on them at the time of the last survey. Don't you agree? Alvaron was following intently. Yes, that seems reasonable enough. But it's also certain that the beam was pointing to none of the other planets. I checked that myself. I know, said Rugon. What I want to discover is why a giant interplanetary relay system is busily transmitting pictures of a world about to be destroyed. Pictures that would be of immense interest to scientists and astronomers. Someone had gone to a lot of trouble to arrange all those panoramic cameras. I'm convinced that those beams were going somewhere. Alvaron started up. You imagine that there might be an outer planet that hasn't been reported? He asked. If so, your theory is certainly wrong. The beam wasn't even pointing in the plane of the solar system. And even if it were, just look at this. He switched off the vision screen and adjusted the controls. Against the velvet curtain of space was hanging a blue-white sphere, apparently composed of many concentric shells of incandescent gas. Even though its immense distance made all movement invisible, it was clearly expanding at an enormous rate. At its center was a blinding point of light, the white dwarf star that the sun had now become. You probably don't realize just how big that sphere is, said Alvaron. Look at this. He increased the magnification until only the center portion of the nova was visible. Close to its heart were two minute condensations, one on either side of the nucleus. Those are the two giant planets of the system. They have still managed to maintain their existence after a fashion, and they were several hundred million miles from the sun. The nova is still expanding, but it's already twice the size of the solar system. Rugan was silent for a moment. Perhaps you're right, he said, rather grudgingly. You've disposed of my first theory, but you still haven't satisfied me. He made several swift circuits of the room before speaking again. Alvaron waited patiently. He knew the almost intuitive powers of his friend, who could often solve a problem when mere logic seemed insufficient. Then, rather slowly, Rugan began to speak again. What do you think of this? He said. Suppose we've completely underestimated this people. Orstron did it once. He thought he could never have crossed space, since they'd only been known radar. Orstron did it once. He thought they could never have crossed space, since they'd only known radio for 2 centuries. Hanser too told me that. Well, Orstron was quite wrong. Perhaps we're all wrong. I've had a look at the material that Clarke brought back from the transmitter. He wasn't impressed by what he found, but it's a marvelous achievement for so short a time. There were devices in that station that belonged to civilizations thousands of years older. Alvaron, can we follow that beam to see where it leads? Alvaron said nothing for a full minute. He had been more than half expecting the question, but it was not an easy one to answer. The main generators were gone completely. There was no point in trying to repair them. But there was still power available, and while there was power, anything could be done in time. It would mean a lot of improvisation and some difficult maneuvers, for the ship still had its enormous initial velocity. Yes, it could be done, and the activity would keep the crew from becoming further depressed, now that the reaction caused by the mission's failure had started to set in. The news that the nearest heavy repair ship could not reach them for 3 weeks had also caused a slump in morale. The engineers, as usual, made a tremendous fuss. Again, as usual, they did the job in half the time they had dismissed as being absolutely impossible. Very slowly, over many hours, the great ship began to discard the speed its main drive had given it in as many minutes. In a tremendous curve, millions of miles in radius, the S-9000 changed its course and the star field shifted around it. The maneuver took 3 days, but at the end of the time, the ship was limping along a course parallel to the beam that had once come from Earth. They were heading out into emptiness, the blazing sphere that had been the sun, slowly dwindling slowly behind them. At the standards of interstellar flight, they were almost stationary. For hours, Rugon strained over his instruments, driving his detector beams far ahead into space. There were almost no planets within many light years, and there was no doubt of that. From time to time, Alvaron came to him, and had to give he had to give the same reply: nothing to report. About a fifth of the time, Rugon's intuition let him down badly. He began to wonder if this was such an occasion. Not until a week later did the needles of the mass detectors quiver feebly at the ends of their scales. But Rugon said nothing, not even to his captain. He waited until he was sure, and he went on waiting until even the short-range scanners began to react and to build up the first faint pictures on the vision screen. Still, he waited patiently until he could interpret the images. Then, when he knew that his wildest fancy was even less than the truth, he called his colleague into the control room. The picture on the vision screen was the familiar one of endless star fields, sun beyond sun to the very limits of the universe. Near the center of the screen, a distant nebula made a patch of haze that was difficult for the eye to grasp. Rugon increased the magnification. The stars flowed out of the field. The little nebula expanded until it filled the screen, and then it was a nebula no longer. A simultaneous gasp of amazement came from all the company at the sight that lay before them. Lying across league after league of space, ranged in a vast three-dimensional array of rows and columns with the precision of a marching army, were thousands of tiny pencils of light. They were moving swiftly, the whole immense lattice holding its shape as a single unit. Even as Alvaron and his comrades watched, their formation began to drift off the screen, and Rugon had to recenter the controls. After a long while, Rugon began to speak. "This is the race," he said softly, "that has known radio for only 2 centuries. The race that we believed had crept to die in the heart of its planet. I examined those images under the highest possible magnification. That is the greatest fleet of which there has ever been a record. Each of these points of light represents a ship larger than our own. Of course, they are very primitive. What you see on the screen are the jets of their rockets. Yes, they dared to use rockets to bridge interstellar space. You realize what that means? It would take them centuries to reach the nearest star. The whole race must have embarked on this journey in the hope that its descendants would complete it generations later. To measure the extent of their accomplishment, think of the ages it took us to conquer space, and the longer ages still before we attempted to reach the stars. Even if we were threatened with annihilation, could we have done it in so short a time? Remember, this is the youngest civilization in the universe. 400,000 years ago, it did not even exist. Where will it be a million years from now?" An hour later, Orestron left the crippled mothership to make contact with the great fleet ahead. As the little torpedo disappeared among the stars, Alvaron turned to his friend and made a remark that Rugon was often to remember in the years ahead. "I wonder what they'll be like," he mused. "Will they be nothing but wonderful engineers, with no art or philosophy? They're going to have such a surprise when Orestron reaches them. I expect it'll be rather a blow to their pride. It's funny how all isolated races think they're the only people in the universe. But they should be grateful to us. We're going to save them a good many 100 years of travel." Alvaron glanced at the Milky Way, lying like a veil of silver mist across the vision screen. He waved toward it with a sweep of a tentacle that embraced the whole circle of the galaxy, from the central planets to the lonely suns of the rim. You know, he said to Rugan, I feel rather afraid of these people. Suppose they don't like our little federation. He waved once more toward the star clouds that lay massed across the screen, glowing with the light of their countless suns. Something tells me they'll be a very determined people, he added. We'd better be polite to them. After all, we only outnumber them about 1,000,000,000 to 1. Rugan laughed at his captain's little joke. 20 years afterward, the remark didn't seem funny. And that, friends, is the conclusion of Arthur C. Clarke's Rescue Party. And my offering for the hashtag 100 Days Project, day 4, I think. Yeah, let's say day 4. Anyway, hope you enjoyed it. Stay tuned. I think next we're going to turn to probably horror. Yeah, I think horror. Good night.